Hello again. We are down now to our final 3 video lessons on the coursework. Once they are done, I'm going to let you loose on it over the summer. You're going to write your first 3,000 word draft. Today we're going to talk about how to compare language, so zooming in from those big techniques to the much smaller techniques of the language choices your writers have made. And in our next lesson we'll be looking at some more examples of the kinds of paragraphs that you should be writing in your coursework. And then the final video that I'm going to upload for you as a resource when you go off to write your coursework is how to reference properly and how to create a bibliography. Once those 3 are out of the way, as I say, then you'll be going. So we're nearly there. How to compare the language that your 2 writers have chosen in your texts. I'm going to give you 5 examples, small extracts from previous coursework, and each of them will show you a different approach to the comparison of language. Here's example number 1. Carter and Shakespeare both use the biblical motif of forbidden fruit to present the societal expectation that women were pure, innocent, and resisted the temptation that led to Eve's original sin in the biblical narrative. In Act 1 of The Taming of the Shrew, Hortensio claims there's small choice in rotten apples, suggesting the same innate corruption in all the women around him, as Carter alludes to throughout her collection. For example, when Wolfe Alice's narrator demands, "How can the bitten apple flesh out its scar again?" So just pause and think, what is it that this comparison has prioritised, looking at the 2 writers, Carter and Shakespeare's use of language? Well, this passage is saying that both authors use the same technique and do it for similar reasons. Then the writer of this paragraph has just given examples to show that Carter and Shakespeare use the same technique for the same reason. Okay, hopefully that's got you nice and warmed up. With the remaining 4 examples that I show you, similarly, I want you to pause, reflect, what kind of comparison of language is going on in this example. Example number 2. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, especially for the character Baby Suggs, colours symbolise, quote, something harmless in the world. She tells Stamp Paid that blue don't hurt nobody, and neither does yellow. Angela Carter is similarly interested in the role colour symbolism plays in the traditional world of fairy tales. However, where Morrison's colour imagery poignantly symbolises peace, Carter's is quite the opposite. The violence of the Count's demands in The Snow Child epitomise the potential colour has to destroy in Carter's world. Quote, "I wish I had a girl as red as blood." So again, pause. What is the writer of this paragraph prioritising in their comparison of language? How have they approached the language of the 2 texts? Hopefully, you've spotted that both authors are using the same technique, but for different reasons. That's how this writer has approached the comparison. Both authors, same technique, different reasons. Can you predict what the next one is going to be an example of? Number 3. Both Carter and Fitzgerald wish to demonstrate the soul-sapping effects of capitalist society's obsessions with material wealth. Carter illustrates this with the imagery of extravagant wealth on display in the, quote, ornate and rotting place of The Lady of the House of Love, the, quote, extraordinarily precious slit-throat jewellery given to the narrator of the titular short story, or the, quote, deathly sensual lethargy of the luxury that defines the tiger's surroundings in his Italian town. The language used to create these images clearly signposts Carter's hatred of materialism. While Fitzgerald does explore a similar imagery of display in Gatsby's, quote, shirts of sheer linen and thick silk and fine flannel, the language that he, or perhaps his narrator Nick, employs in these moments only suggests admiration for Gatsby's wealth. Instead, the real condemnation of capitalist materialism comes through the language Fitzgerald employs to describe the Buchanans, the disdain in Nick's voice as he describes Daisy sobbing over the shirts, her voice muffled. The author couches his most barbed attack in these words. So a slightly longer example, but again, what approach to language comparison has this writer taken? Well, hopefully you can see that the authors use different techniques for the same reasons. That's the approach this writer has taken. Now, look at the sentence that begins, while Fitzgerald does explore a similar image. From that, you might have been confused into thinking that the writer here was saying, well, both Carter and Fitzgerald use the same language technique. But look closer. The thing that makes this a really sophisticated comparison of language is that the writer here has said, well, both have the same reason, and the way that the writers convey these reasons might look similar because there's all this imagery of materialism, but actually the way that these writers show that they're against materialism is in quite different techniques. Carter, yes, she uses the imagery of all these horrible, over-the-top, materialistic obsessions. But Fitzgerald, even though he uses that same technique, where he really gets across his anger at materialism is in the disdainful tone of his narrator, a very different technique. You must be expecting it by now. Here we've got example number 4, where the writer is focusing on how the authors use different techniques because their different reasons would demand it. Example, the hyperbolic language of, quote, I never had to give it to nobody else, and the one time I did it was took from me, they held me down and took it, that's from Toni Morrison, Beloved, shows Seethe authenticating her devotion to and maternal love for Beloved. It will never fade as a result of her guilt. The maternal emotions Carter explores throughout her collection, and especially in The Snow Child, are far less clear-cut, more complex because of the competition men force women into with their own children. Hyperbolic expressions of devotion would be completely out of place in this story. Instead, Carter uses the driest, sparsest prose to show the Countess's disdain. When she touched the rose, she dropped it. It bites, she said. So to recap, that's the authors using different techniques because it would be ridiculous if they used the same techniques to express the reasons the messages they want to get across. Their different reasons demand different techniques. So you'll be at the point in your coursework where you've compared the writer's messages, you've explained the context they were writing in and how that led to the messages. You'll maybe have evaluated your critics and the theories that apply to your two texts. You'll have analysed the structure and the form and the genre, and so you'll know that you at this point need to compare the language choices to really get to the nitty-gritty of the two texts. And you will consider the 4 options I've given you so far. And you might want to use this little graph on screen now to help you with that consideration. And then the final thing to bear in mind, at the top of the mark scheme for this coursework, you'll read the word evaluate a lot. That's how you get to level 5, you evaluate. And you can evaluate the language choices in the same way that you evaluate your theory or you evaluate the structural choices. And here's an example of how an evaluation like that might work. In The Bloody Chamber, sexual relationships liberate characters, such as in The Company of Wolves, where the protagonist ripped off his shirt for him and flung it into the fire in the fiery wake of her own discarded clothing. Carter, 1979, page 138. Contrastingly, in NW, sex is referenced, but in a much more gruesome and graphic manner. So the technique there is the same. But what this particular example is doing, which I'd encourage you all to try to do, is evaluating which author does it better, stronger, alternatively weaker or less poignantly. They're evaluating how strongly each author uses the technique in question. So there you have 5 approaches to analysing and comparing the language used by your 2 authors. Really, you should try to use all 5 throughout your coursework. Get practicing.